Hey, it's Richard here. You might not be seeing the show notes, and so therefore I just want to add this little bit of context to the front. We were speaking with Indian-based journalist Rishika Pardikar before the Air India Flight 171 crash with the loss of at least 274 lives. Our thoughts obviously go out to the families who are grieving, but if you're wondering why it didn't come up in our conversation given the timing of the release of this episode, it hadn't happened. I just want to make that clear. It's a very interesting conversation. Rashik is an amazing reporter, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode.
So I think it's generally true that we don't know much about people who live in the margins of our own countries. Or even if you ask me about the realities of places that are at the borders of Bengaluru, of my city, I wouldn't know all of their realities. So generally, people on margin lands, whether it is the margins of a city, margins of a country, you wouldn't really know what their life is like. So I think that would always require a bit of context.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan. Today, we're speaking with Rishika Pardikar, a Bengaluru-based journalist whose recent reporting in Drilled and Frontline, amongst other places, on energy and climate, and offers a clear-eyed view into India's deeply complex climate energy landscape, from the coal fields of central India to the crisis in climate forecasting to land rights. Rishika's work gets behind the headlines to tell the story of policy, power, and science on the ground. We'll talk about what it means to report these stories from inside India and what the rest of the world often misses. Rishika, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, this is great. Like people talking from different countries, from different realities. I always enjoy these discussions.
So I wanted to just kind of start out by asking you, why, what pulls you into this beat?
I started off as an environment reporter itself. So from the very beginning, my interest has been in environmental issues. I tried covering politics a little briefly from New Delhi. This was for about 6 months. But even then, when I was covering the political beat, also I used to swerve into environment because that is where my interest lies. So yeah, from the get go itself, I have been interested in environmental issues. I think it's a very core to life. But also, my reporting is not just on environment; it's also about land rights issues
Mm.
because in countries like ours, especially, there are people's life and livelihood is very closely linked to the land, whether it is farmers or tribal communities. There are many communities like this for whom land means everything. So it's not like they can just up and move like elsewhere, like in some other countries. So
Mm.
it's not as easy as okay, you give them compensation and they can move. Uh,
That is something that feels like it's different for how, in terms of the types of things that wind up on your agenda for reporting than they might be for here in the UK or from America, where I'm from. Although perhaps there's some crossover, particularly with tribal rights. I saw you reporting several places about uh, basically taking away protections from one area within the Andaman Islands and Nicobar, and kind of those tribal areas, and then declaring a another zone to be protected, but that had complications which hadn't necessarily been thought through. Like, so can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because again, it's a fascinating story, but it's not something that I would come across in my day to day.
so there are these group of islands. It's an archipelago of about 500, 600 odd islands. This is off the coast of mainland India. It's closer to Southeast Asia. So the landscape is also closer to Sumatra, Borneo. So it's complete rainforest areas, some of
Mm-hmm.
these islands. So the Indian government has planned a mega project. It is a huge 70,000 crore rupees. Like you should do the conversion, but it's a huge mega project.
Yeah.
It entails a construction of a huge port, an airport, uh, townships. It's a very big project, and they are building all of this on tribal lands. So
Mm-hmm.
there are these two tribal communities, the Shompen and the Nicobaris, and their again their life and livelihood is completely dependent on the land. One community is almost isolated, so they have no contact, almost zero contact with the outside world. So it's in these kind of lands that the government is building a transshipment terminal and an airport. So I actually traveled there, and I spoke to the people, and then I brought out what their issues are. And there are also many endangered species there. There's this huge turtle called the giant leatherback turtle. They come and they nest there in hundreds every year. So this port is coming up on the nesting beach of these endangered turtles. And there are many other endemic species also, endemic endangered species.
Mm-hmm.
So I reported about all of these kind of issues from Andaman Nicobar. Yeah.
I mean, and India, such. I mean, again, I have. I'll confess, I've had a couple of near misses. I have not made it, but even if I had made it to India, going to one place in India is like saying you visited Asia. I mean, it just is a massively complex society with so many different facets and cultures. So I guess one of the questions I had, I guess, as a reporter is like, how do you think about who you're writing for and reporting for? How do you think about your audience? How do you conceive of them? Who you're writing for?
So generally, audience is not on the top of my mind, I would say, because if I'm following a story, I
Hmm.
try to see what's happening. If I'm reporting from the field, for example, I would try to ensure that I get their perspective right. So that is my topmost priority. um, but then obviously during the editing process, the editors will ask me questions. Okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? Can you add a bit more context here, because people wouldn't know this aspect of Nicobar Islands, or they wouldn't know what this means to this community. So during the editing process, that comes out more thoroughly and more clearly, I think, because it's not on the top of my mind when I'm doing the reporting process. Later, when I write and then it goes through editing, I think then it becomes more clear of who I'm writing for, or not really who I'm writing for, but how do I make it more clear for who I'm writing it for? Because generally, it's a general audience that I write for, whether it is science or policy or land rights or climate or whatever else it is. It is a general audience.
So I wanted to ask about that because it's also because itself India is so complex and so many different facets. Do you find that when you're reporting something out from the Andaman Islands, the Nicobaris, and some of their kind of challenges with this mega project, is it something that resonates with people who might be in Bengaluru or in Mumbai, that they kind of get it, or what kind of assumptions do you need to make about what they know about what's going on in other parts of their own country?
So I think it's generally true that we don't know much about people who live in the margins of our own countries. Or even if you ask me about the realities of places that are at the borders of Bengaluru, of my city, I wouldn't know all of their realities. So generally, people on margin lands, whether it is the margins of a city, margins of a country, you wouldn't really know what their life is like. So I think that would always require a bit of context. But my stories actually did quite well, and I did another video, a podcast also, video interview about the same Nicobar, about the project that's happening. That also did quite well. So people want to know, I think, from my experience of reporting these issues, they do want to know, they are interested, but they might not know a lot about a lot of the context from the beginning. So I think, yeah, but there is definitely interest. Yeah.
And is it how do you feel about? I mean, again, we talk sometimes, very very silly ways in the West, often about the idea that there's one global narrative on this stuff, and usually, of course, it's centered on the voices that we normally hear, who turn up at COP and turn up at these conferences and turn up at the UN. And how does that sit with you as you're reporting out from India and covering stories inside of India? Does that provide context that's helpful, unhelpful, something that you kind of consciously are um, trying to kind of correct, or is there any? I mean, what goes through your mind when you're trying to think, does it matter, or you just kind of just dedicated to the
It's
story?
very prominently on my mind. So I've reported. So my first COP was Glasgow. So I actually went. I got a fellowship, so I could go to Glasgow. And then the next year, I was doing a fellowship in Germany for 3 months at Max Planck. So Max Planck Law. So I was there. So I ended up attending Bonn as well. So back to back, I attended two COP, and those were the only two COPs I attended in person, because otherwise it's very difficult as a freelancer to get support to actually travel. But yeah, so the problem is that Western narratives become the dominant narrative, because these are the people who can firstly afford to come to places like COP, and secondly, so the media landscape is also very different in different countries. So, for example, in countries like India, there are a few climate outlets, maybe one or two that focus exclusively on climate, but then it's not very prevalent. So, because our issues on a day-to-day basis are very different from what it would be in the UK or the US, for example. So climate is not the dominant part of the discourse of public discourse in countries like India, because have basic developmental poverty issues, or even indigenous rights and tribal rights, their violations. So even these happen on a daily basis, poverty especially, and developmental deficits. So in this context, climate doesn't always take number one priority. So our media is also not very equipped to handle issues like climate as much, or as often, I would say, because when they do, when places like Africa or India or Latin America, whatever, when I when I do see climate stories from them, I think it's a lot more powerful because it comes from rooted realities. Whatever the perspective might be, whether you want your country to take more action, less action, whatever it is, it's still far more grounded in the reality that they see. But then I think it is far less in countries like ours than elsewhere, because there are so many issues that dominate the daily public discourse. But yeah, I think I constantly try to see, okay, how would this help? How would it not help? I'm constantly in that mode where I see something being pushed as a global narrative, which might not exactly be suitable for India, for example. So for India, if people read the report on drill that I wrote recently from the coal belt,
Hmm.
you will see that it's not. So the coal story in India is not only about emissions. So it's also about air pollution. It's also about tribal rights issues, because many coal mines have come on lands that were previously tribal forested lands. And air pollution is another issue that has come up. And plus, there are also issues like jobs. So, for example, coal is not just coal, right? Coal supports iron and steel. Coal supports brick making. Coal, in and of itself, supports millions of jobs across the country. And then there's transportation. There are a lot of allied activities that are tied to coal. And India already has a huge unemployment problem, much like South Africa as well.
Hmm.
So the country realities are very different, I think. And whenever I see global narratives, which are mostly Western narratives, because that is what is dominant, they don't apply as much to global South countries. So
Right.
I think that's a problem. Yeah.
I mean, that's, yeah, having again spent some but not enough time, outside of the West and myself, it's something that does strike you, that once you leave the bubble, about how irrelevant a lot of it seems, to folk, who are just trying to get through their day to day. So let's talk about this piece that you had in Drilled, which was great, in India's coal belt. Can you, maybe let's talk a little bit more about that. First of all, just help me to situate for people who aren't intimately familiar with India's geography. Where is the coal belt, in the larger, in the scheme of things there?
So there's central and eastern India. Central to east, that I would
Right.
say is the coal belt. Uh, And coal mining has been going on in these areas since British time. Like commercial coal mining has been going on since colonization time, and even post independence. Also, this is the same area where it has happened, because that is where our coal reserves are, central and eastern India. So Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, West Bengal. These are like the dominant coal states.
Right. And again, it's, all the different factors you mentioned. A lot of the economic factors, the social factors, the fact is that it employs so many millions of people, in a country where employment is not something to take lightly. So I mean, and obviously there's an energy security issue as well. I mean, is that, so there's so many different facets to it. I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly where to start. But in terms of the, like, let's maybe start with the workers and communities, because I think that those are the ones where your reporting is really centered a lot, about how they see the I suppose a future for their industry. Do they embrace the idea that this is going to change and have a transition, or is this something that there is either they're not thinking about it, or they're just they don't think it's relevant for them, or they're afraid of it?
From what I have seen, the energy transition talk is not very prevalent in these areas because it's not happening as yet. So from India, you would see a lot of academic publications probably talking about a coal transition, a just energy transition, and all that. But on the ground, when you travel, you don't hear anything about it because it's not happening as yet. So obviously coal mines have shut down over the last few years, but that's the regular turnover. It's not as part of a transition or anything. So the regular turnover does happen. Coal mines shut down, new coal mines open up. I've written previously about coal mines being shut down also, and they were not done very well. So they had to fend for themselves. So they were just, yeah. So this has happened before, and
Right.
since it is not part of a transition plan, workers will, in some cases workers just moved by themselves to another mine. In some places, the management only wanted workers somewhere else, so they moved them. But it wasn't a planned kind of transition of what would happen to workers, or even the community. So what happens in India is, if there's a coal district, uh, an entire township comes up in that area, and not just the one set up by the company, even otherwise. So because the transportation, you need workers, and those workers, they end up living there because that's where their jobs are, then their families. And so the a whole community comes up around the coal mine, from the small tea shop sellers to like lorries and trucks that carry all the mines, that carry all the mine coal. Um, so the dependency is very intricate, I would say. And if you don't manage this well, then you
Mhm.
will leave an entire community without anything.
Right.
But as of now, this fear is not there because it's not real as yet. Because if you go to any of these places, they only talk about increasing coal production and how many benefits this would bring.
Right.
So the management in all of these areas, they are not really thinking very seriously about a transition, because even the Indian government also says peak coal is at least 10 years away. So very recently, they were saying that peak coal is probably 2035. That is again 10 years ahead. And then it will probably plateau and then it will fall.
Mm.
So if we are still 10 years away from a peak, that means until then it will keep increasing. So the reality of a transition has not hit the ground yet.
And it's something again we talked in the green room before we started recording that there was a story yesterday about data from May, and like I'm not going to ask you to quiz you on what happened, in every single economic report that's ever come out, but it did seem notable that there seemed to be, as we've seen in a lot of other places, the adoption of solar, the deployment of solar happening faster than people anticipated and having an effect on, the fuel mix for generation. And whether that's utility scale or behind the meter in terms of like people just putting it up on their own house, having a battery maybe, and that being rather than have to deal with the discoms, which I know like Akshat Ratti has, written colorfully about his parents' dealings with the discoms, but just trying to get a feed-in tariff, get solar hooked up to the grid. Um, so, if people just kind of go ahead and do that, is there, is that something that, how does that sit? What are you seeing, even from where you are in Bengaluru, as opposed to, the coal belt?
So residential rooftop has taken off a little bit, but then there are again policy problems. Um, if there is not a lot of buy-in, then that's again I would put it on the government, because policy is not very clear, not very beneficial. So I mean, if the feed-in tariffs work better, I think maybe there would be more people who actually operate for rooftop solar. But then, yeah, increasingly we do see across countries in India that people are going in for more solar rooftops, especially in metro cities like the one I am in, Bangalore, or Delhi, or Mumbai, or Kolkata. So it is happening. Apart from this, two-wheeler EVs have really taken off. So that's another thing. Because in India, so India largely relies on two-wheelers. It's not a very rich country. So more than cars, we have a huge vehicle registrations. If you see, it's mostly two-wheelers. And in two-wheelers, like if you go on the street in Bangalore, you'll see many, many, many EVs. Many people are buying EVs now, and that's affordable also. And even the government is very invested in this because they want to reduce import dependency on oil. The government has a clear policy that they want to reduce imports of oil. So the EV push is there. The rooftop pushes could be better. The EV pushes, I think it's working fine. I don't know, maybe it could be better, but from what I see, EV adoption is happening. But EV two wheelers, I mean,
Yeah,
not that much.
no, I
Buses, yes.
understand.
In my own city, I see just today there was a small news clip uh, about more buses, airport buses in Bangalore, EV buses. They're getting a whole new fleet of EV buses to the airport. So yeah, EV buses, EV two wheelers, rooftop. Yeah, this is going great. But then I think coal will remain mainstay. At least from what I can see now, 10, 15 years, coal will still be the major source of energy for this country.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot to critique on that also.
Sorry, because say that last part again. I didn't.
There's a lot to critique about that also. About yeah, where we should be investing, how much should we be investing in what.
Right. It's something that I mean, again, like we didn't. This kind of came out in between setting this up uh, and now. But the Economist says the most recent issue they have, talking about kind of they frame it as a dilemma for policymakers in India, where the reduction of air pollution might in fact accelerate warming, which might take us to talking a little bit about your interview with Jagadish Shukla in a minute. But I think just that's a I can't imagine what it feels like to read something like that, where it's like, well, they're kind of screwed either way. I'm sorry about that, but there you go. That basically whatever they do, if they get rid of the pollution, they're going to warm faster. that's bad, but they're going to have to do it anyway, so that's also bad. I mean, does that scan? Does that feel like, is that something that rings true for you and how you see these dilemmas that are coming up, or are publications like The Economist not doing a good service to their readers by framing it that way?
So are you talking about the sulfur? What article
Yeah.
is it?
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I'm not going to. Rather than ask you to comment on an article you haven't read, it's more the general principle about how where we go. So basically, yeah, the adoption of air conditioning is going to, drive demand growth. That demand growth is going to require more coal in the meantime, um, and that's going to require, that's going to lead to more, um, you know, aerosol pollutions, particulates, that have had this, basically India is an outlier in that it has not warmed as fast as lots of other places, and the attribution seems to be leaning towards air pollution, right? In various forms. And so if you remove the air pollution, then you're warm faster. But if you warm faster, you're going to have more demand for air conditioning, and so that's this vicious circle. So
So recently, I think the government scrapped a mandatory policy for FGDs, for sulfur pollution for thermal power plants.
mm,
Uh, so the government's thinking seems to be that the so in the sulfur content of India's coal is less compared to some other countries, especially if you compare to China, for example.
mm,
Uh, I think except for Meghalaya, one or two states where you get coal from, elsewhere the sulfur content is quite low.
right.
So their argument is that if sulfur content is low, then we can manage with ESPs, electrostatic. So there are different kinds of equipment, I think, for different levels of sulfur pollution. Uh, but anyway, I think the government seems to have had a change of mind. They made a complete U-turn on the FGD installation. I don't know. I'm yet to understand the science of it and what they're saying and whether it's justified or not. I'm yet to make up my mind and read more about it. But it is true that sulfur content of Indian coal is lesser than China, for example, or some
Mm,
other places as well. But then we have so much coal and we have so many power plants that even if per unit it's less, if you're still burning so much coal, then you will still be contributing to a lot of air pollution.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of this argument, but yeah. So if we get rid of the sulfur, then there'll be more warming. So that's true. But then if you have sulfur pollution, then more people's health is impacted from that. So I don't think I would argue for more sulfur pollution. Uh,
No, no, yeah, I don't think anyone's arguing for that. I just think it's the dilemma, and it just basically there's no easy answer about how you solve for all these
yeah.
different variables at the same time. Um,
But one thing the Economist article wrote well was the efficiency. So the efficiency of Indian appliances are generally bad. So we see this. This is a reality that all of us acknowledge.
mm,
That if something is rated 3 star or 4 star, we will still buy it as Indian consumers. So it's a rating of 5 stars.
yeah,
So of five, I would generally go for 3 or 4, depending on the cost. But I know that 3 or 4 doesn't really mean anything in my energy bills. Like it wouldn't really make that much of a difference.
mm,
So I think that Economist article compared the efficiency of Indian appliances to Chinese ones, and they said that even the best of Indian appliances wouldn't qualify in China because their standards are much better. So,
mm,
so and if we make our appliances more efficient, I think the energy demand also can come down a lot more, even if it
right.
is like the upfront costs are more. This is like EVs, so the
Yeah,
upfront cost is a little more, but over time, it's generally the benefits outweigh the cost.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think in the United States in particular, where there hadn't been load growth on the grid for 20 years, part of the reason for that was this efficiency gains that were made both in appliances and data centers and things like that. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the science and the politics of science. You had a great interview with Jagadish Shukla, and I'm probably saying that badly, but so please forgive me. In Frontline, and you know, he what comes across really clearly, talking about the state of climate and monsoon forecasting, is the political valence it has, that it's controversial, that he feels himself to be under a lot of scrutiny. Um, why is it so politically charged?
so I think during his time, this was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I think. So I think back then, definitely India's forecasting capabilities were not as great, especially because we did not have a supercomputer.
Hmm,
So India came late to the whole supercomputer game. It was first the US and Europe, again, because of it's a poorer country.
Sure.
So we didn't have the money to invest in a supercomputer, and then we had to buy from the US, which again cost a lot of money. So it came from a space where forecasting capabilities were not as developed in India when he was still new to this field. So he came with a lot of critique as to why are we not investing in it, and I think he had to face some political battles also within the forecasting field that he was working in. But thankfully, what he did worked, and India actually got a supercomputer, I think, in the 80s.
Right.
Uh, and then he was tasked with supervising the installation and seeing how it works and all that. So I think he comes from that space where he has seen the value of forecasting for his. So he's from a very poor village in Uttar Pradesh. So I'm from South India, which is relatively better off, I would say, financially as well. But
Hmm.
Uttar Pradesh is one of the poorer states in the country. It's very populous also. And the villages are extremely backward, I would say. So even today, developmental gains have not reached some of these villages. So I can only imagine what it was like when he was growing up in one of the villages in Uttar Pradesh.
Hmm.
And he has seen what a bad monsoon can do to farmers in his village.
Right.
So he came from that reality, and then he saw India not investing in better forecasting capabilities. And I think he started off with that. And yeah, he did get some flack for it, I think, early on when he started criticizing. But I
Mm.
think it has led to something really good because India has a, not a perfect forecasting system, but much, much better than what we did 20, 30 years ago. And yeah, I think some of the credit goes to him, and he actually challenged some very dominant theories in predictions, in monsoon predictions, and predictions in general, globally as well. So this brought benefits not just to India but also globally because chaos theory, butterfly effect. He was a very prominent voice that challenged these kind of theories and said that okay, prediction is possible.
And he didn't seem to be particularly impressed with like the general level, not you, but the general level of media coverage of some of these issues and whether or not, as you say, again, I don't think it's an Indian only issue. It's certainly the case in the United States, certainly the case in the UK. I think it's just most places it's hard, right? Some of these issues are hard to get your head around, and they don't stay in one little box. You have to know a little bit about lots of different things to even start to put together the picture. And that's time consuming, and most newsrooms aren't investing in people in the same way that they might have been 20, 30, or 40 years ago. So, what do you think? What else struck you about the conversation? With Shukla.
I think one question I really wanted to pose to him is about this government, the Modi government, because so what they project on a global, on an international stage is sometimes different from what they do domestically.
Mm,
So for example, at COP or elsewhere also, and actually even see, so this is the strange thing. So the Modi government does boast about investing in scientific advancement and all that, but at the same time, they are trying to bring in religion into science. We see this in many aspects. We see this in Ayurveda, for example. Um, so Ayurveda, I'm not against it or anything, but then you do proper studies, you do proper control methods, and then you come up with a claim. But then this government is just going blind, and they're bringing a lot of religious aspects also into some of these debates.
And, and again, and India certainly would not be the only place where that happened. Again, I'm from the United States originally, so I have to put up with that stuff in my feed quite a lot, often from relatives. But never mind. So he mentioned something in particular that there was a study rather funding for a study. Is it Havans?
Yeah, Havan, yeah.
Havan. And maybe could you explain a little bit about that? Because I found that to be fascinating and again very resonant with the types of things that we are seeing right now in my home country in the United States.
So, so in Hindu custom, there are these ritualistic fires that we have, and this is for pujas, like for rituals, religious
Yeah.
practice. So
Hmm.
they burn a fire. So this fire is like I think 5 by 5 feet. It's that much,
Yeah.
and in some cases they do many of those fires. So an institute, a very reputed institute, sadly, IITM, Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, they are currently doing a study trying to see if these havans have any effect on rainfall. Because for the longest time, the custom, so this was just traditional belief, custom, you can call it whatever,
Right.
was that if you do these havans, if you do these fires, then it will bring more rainfall. So
Right.
people believe this across countries. It's not just India.
Sure.
So that if you do this practice, then it will bring more rain. If you pray to the rain god, it will bring more rain. So this is part of that whole culture.
Hmm.
But the sad thing here is that in that same that same institute and people who are heading the study, people who are investing in it, they seem very reluctant to actually support any conclusion that will not fall in line with what they believe. Plus, it's a very nonsensical study because to actually impact rainfall, the scale. So I told you, right? So
Yeah,
these fires are like 5 by 5. Like it's that small. Even if you do like 20 of these,
yeah,
for it cannot be large scale enough to have an impact on rainfall, even local level rainfall. It does not.
yeah.
So I don't know what the purpose of this study is. So you will not get any significant result from a study like this. Plus, there are many parts of India where there are spontaneous fires. So waste, for example, because we don't treat our waste very well. We don't recycle it very well. We just dump it in open grounds,
Yeah.
and these catch fires like spontaneous fires because methane. So, and especially in the summer, there are many of these spontaneous fires which can be studied just to see what impact it has, whether on rainfall or something else.
Hmm.
So, without any investing in an actual havan, in a religious, ritualistic practice, you can actually study what impact burning something can have on rainfall, but they're not doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think yeah, I mean, I think there was it was 30 years ago there was an attempt to get a government grant to study the impact of people in the United States praying remotely for the health of patients, and like there was people in the United States Congress who were very keen on getting money for that study, and so yeah, that was a bit of a story at the time. So yeah, as you say, this is a worldwide phenomenon, but it does seem to be we're headed in a direction where this, you know, religion, nationalism, uh, are kind of coming up head to head with environmental science and climate science more and more. Which I think that was for me the slightly alarming thing is the direction of travel that we seem to be on, and it seems to be happening as much in India as anywhere else.
That's definitely true. And it's very sad also.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wanted to just maybe close in the last few minutes what we have here in terms of talking a little bit about, you know, I think you've quoted people saying the solution to climate anxiety is climate action. Um, do you see journalism as a form of climate action?
Not necessarily, because I think journalism is speaking truth to power. It's our basic responsibility is to the truth. So even so, I say this. I've said this before also. So just because it's a solar project doesn't mean it's done well. So I know I have reported about solar projects in Western India. So Western India is there's a bit of a desert landscape in Western India,
Hmm.
and many solar projects have come up there because it's more efficient to build there because it's a desert area.
Right.
But they have come up on lands which the local community there considers sacred. These are called orans. So in Hindi, it's called an oran. Oran is like a sacred land where people take their goats, sheep to graze. I was not sheep, sorry, goats, and then their cows to graze there. And
Mm.
in many of these lands there are also local temples because they consider the land as sacred.
Mm.
And then these solar developers, they came in, they cordoned off, they fenced off the whole area, they took over the land. So now the community cannot graze their animals in those lands. They cannot access those lands, and it was taken over without their consent. So
Mm.
just because it's a solar project doesn't mean it's good like for everything. It may be good for the emissions, but it can be bad on so many other fronts.
Mm.
Uh, Same with wind, same with also. I was reading a book recently about Congo, uh, about the mining that happens in the Congo, and it has no safeguards at all, whether on labor, whether on environment. So we all talk a lot about how solar is very cheap, but why is it cheap? It's cheap because there's a lot of slave labor. It's cheap because there's a lot of child labor. It's cheap because there are no environmental safeguards in any of these places. And Congo is a rainforest area. So if you claim to care about rainforests and how they sequester carbon, then what are we doing?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I wouldn't say that all of my work is climate action. Um,
Sure.
maybe you can categorize it that way, but more than
Yeah. No. Sorry. I guess maybe I could have asked that, framed that better. Suppose I wasn't asking whether you think of yourself as an activist so much as whether or not, uh, again, you could have chosen to work more on politics. You could have stayed in New Delhi, right? You could have, potentially, gone to a different country entirely, and covered an entirely different beat. But you stay with this beat. And I'm just like to kind of back to my original question about like what keeps you doing it, because it's not easy. It's a difficult beat, and it is something that not everybody wants to do. So I'm always curious in talking to somebody who's spending, devoting a lot of their waking life to writing and reporting on these issues. Like, why? What keeps you going? What keeps you wanting to do that?
climate climate change is a big challenge that we face today. So as an environment, so obviously my sympathies are with environmental issues because that's what I care most about, and that's why I'm an environment reporter. And in the environment beat, I think climate is a big challenge today, and it has to be tackled. But how we tackle it, or how governments are failing to tackle it, I think that is that is where I get my motivation from. I want to see what governments and companies are doing. Some of the
Mm.
most powerful companies, like Adani, for example, in the name of climate action, what are they doing? In the name of coal, what are they doing? So yeah, for me, that is it's a huge challenge. It's a public interest topic. I know that India will be badly impacted. For example, if a monsoon fails, right? Whether it's a heat wave, monsoon failure, whatever it is, I know people will be impacted much more than if you're in a wealthier country. But in the name of climate, a lot of things are also going wrong. So that's where my motivation comes from. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think it's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that example of the Orons. So that's a story I'll go back and look for some more information about. It feels very similar to the, like Greta Thunberg, kind of spotlighted the issue in with the Sami in, the northern parts of Sweden and Finland, having similar issues with grazing rights. So what are the stories that you know, you hope to be telling next? I mean, what's on your agenda? What's new that you'll be looking at as emergent kind of themes in your reporting, over the next months and years?
So I do want to track India's climate action plans more closely. So, like specific policies, what are they following?
Mm.
That's one report I'm working on. Another one, there are a lot of enhanced rock weathering is something I've been wanting to understand because a lot of companies are seem to be working on it, but we don't know clearly what's happening. What is MRV? How is the MRV process, for example?
Mm.
So that's another issue that in climate that I want to track, and I also want to go back to the coal belt areas. So maybe in the course of the next few years, anyway, that is something that I will anyway do, because I want to know what's happening, what the Indian government is saying, and what's happening on the ground. Because Modi can talk about uh, renewable energy and all that, but unless it actually translates on the ground to an actual just energy transition, then it doesn't really mean much for people. So I will be going back to coal belts as well. I want to visit the Western Indian states for the renewable energy, like to see what's happening there. Um, yeah, apart from that, like these new funkier ideas like enhanced rock weathering and climate and tech startups, that's another thing that's really on my mind that I want to scrutinize.
Okay. I mean, and it's yeah. I mean, actually, one of the second interview we did for the show was actually with Jim Mann from Undo, which is one of the enhanced rock weathering startups based here in the UK. I think I'm not sure if they got the X Prize or not. I think they were in the running for it anyway. As kind of a carbon removal technique. Um, I mean, it's something else that's kind of been bubbling up the agenda, and I've done a couple of episodes about about this. People talking about this is what's called solar radiation management or geoengineering, and India often comes up as being a, kind of an indexed case about, well, the risks of doing that are, if you mess with the monsoon, like that's going to be really, really, really catastrophic. Is that something that, I mean, is it part of the conversation in India?
Yeah. So there's a science institute in the city where I am from, Bangalore. It's called Indian Institute of Science.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some scientists there who are specifically looking at what kind of impact this would have on the monsoon in particular. So there are scientists studying this particular phenomenon, this particular effect, uh, because a lot of geoengineering science is coming from the global north, and we don't know to what extent impacts on our countries are actually being factored in. So there are people here, thankfully, at least like a handful who are trying to see what would happen to the monsoon. They're trying to do studies. But yeah, that is one worry definitely. And countries that have the money to actually go ahead and do experimental projects will go ahead. So we can't really put a stop to that. What we can do is study and see what will happen. So I'm all
Right.
in for studying geoengineering. I think we need so if you say science, and if you think of science as a study, as okay, let's see what would happen if we do this, then I think we need definitely more of it. We need more studies on geoengineering also. So I know that there's a prominent activist statement that okay, we need to stop, or we need to put a pause on geoengineering studies because then it would give legitimacy to these projects. I'm
Mm.
not one of those. I think we really need to study it because I'm worried about the Indian monsoon. we have to, yeah.
Well, I mean, and it's something that I think we had an episode with Andy Parker, who's it's based in the UK, but it's an organization that's dedicated to trying to get science from the global south to be the main part of the conversation in terms of global governance of these issues, potentially experimentation or just the research. So we'll definitely put a link in the show notes. Where can people keep in touch with you? I mean, like, let's say that they want to get you to do work with you to do a documentary, to go back to the coal belt, or do a book deal out of that. How do people keep in touch with you and follow your work?
So you can find me on Blue Sky. You can find me on Twitter.
We will put links to all of those in the show notes in terms of how people can follow your work. You're a great follow on Blue Sky. That's how I came across you initially. So people, if they haven't followed you already, hopefully if you're listening to this, go and do that. I think you are also in our starter pack, so you can subscribe to a bunch of climate, environmental, and energy journalists at the same time. And Rishika, we're so glad you could make the time today to come on Wicked Problems. ಬೇರೆ ಭಾಷೆ ಆಡೋ ಬಾಯಿ ಆದ್ರೂ ಕನ್ನಡ ವೇನಂತಾಯಿ ಮನಸ್ಸು ಹೊಡೆದ ತೆಂಗಿನಕಾಯಿ ಟ್ರಾಫಿಕ್ ಜಾಮಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೋ ಸಾಯಿ ನಮಸ್ತೆ ಏನಿದು ಅವಸ್ಥೆ ಇದೇನು ಹಂಪ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸಮಾಧಿನ ಯಾಕಿಷ್ಟು ರಂಪ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಸಮಾಧಾನ ಸಾವಧಾನ ಬೆಂದ ಕಾಡೂರು I was Shankarnath fan. Just hold on, Bengaluru. ಸಾವಧಾನ ಬೆಂದ ಕಾಡೂರು ಸೌಂಡಕ್ಕೆ ಹಾರ್ನಿ Just hold on, Bengaluru. ಏ ರಾಜಾ
ಸರ್ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಪೇಟಿಎಂ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡ್ಲಾ?
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech. The place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
1.5 ಕೋಡಿ